I've never been vocal like I have been in the last 10 years. And I come from very working class background. I mean, I grew up in lay law.
Mm-hmm.
My dad couldn't read or write. So I'm not like from some sort of born to rule area, not establishment Melbourne or anything like that. I just want people who are in public office to tell the truth. And I don't like it when they try and pretend that they forget things.
Welcome back to The Last Days of Rome. First things first, please subscribe to the channel, especially if this isn't your first episode. It would really mean a lot to us because we're trying to grow this thing, obviously. Today's interviewee is Tony Tardio, a radio presenter here at Rete Italia, as well as 3AW. With Tony, I cover a range of topics ranging from how the media landscape's changed, what bothers him about politics today, all the way to why it's important to be humble. My impression of Tony, both from our time on air and also from our chat off air, is that he is someone who sincerely cares about Victoria, its people and the way it's governed, and I'm sure that'll come across very clearly. I hope you enjoy the chat. Tony Tardio, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm honoured that you've asked me.
You've worked in radio for over 4 decades now. How do you feel about the future of the medium? It's very interesting because unlike television and newspapers, the other two elements of legacy media, radio's been able to thrive for longer than those two. But is it dying a slow death as a result of podcasting, or will it always be around?
Well, I think podcast is a big threat, particularly for the radio that we do, which is talk radio. I think talking is what people do. It's a natural thing that humans do. And that's what talk radio is. In the past, it's allowed people to ring up and have their say. Was the original social media. The stations that I work for, the news, and they do interviews with the prime ministers and leaders of the country and premiers and stuff. So people have access to them because they can ring up and ask them questions. So that's quite a big thing. But podcasts now allow you, and I listen to podcasts, and it allows you to listen to what you're interested in. You don't have to listen to the broad spectrum of things. If you like racing or if you like cars or sport, you can listen to that. And there's only 24 hours in a day. 8 hours we spend sleeping, some hours we spend working, so the leisure time of listening to stuff is limited. I think talk radio will always be there, but it'll be eaten up a little. It already is by Google and Meta and these companies that have eaten away a bit at the advertising, which makes it hard because radio stations used to be a license to print money. The big stations, they made a lot of money. In Melbourne, when there was only 8 AM stations, no FM stations, they made a lot of money. And then FM came in and there was a bit more competition. And that's why we're seeing networking, which is reducing the costs of the radio stations. Where it's going to be in 50 years, I don't know. People have said 3AW will slowly decline. Maybe it will. I worry about the investment because, in a business, you have to keep putting money in, putting resources in. And if you don't have the money to do that, bit by bit by bit, it deteriorates. But I think people will always want to talk.
They do it online as well, though, I suppose. Like you have people calling into live streaming shows.
Yeah, I think, though, if you can dominate one market, then you know that if something big happens, for example, in Melbourne, then people will flock to the dominant radio station to hear what's going on. And the key for a station like 3AW is to stay in the middle of what's happening, to position itself. So have good guests, have leaders come in, and have good presenters that can tap into what people want. And that's managing, that's, constant sort of reassessing and making those sort of decisions.
Has the content changed at all? I mean, has the smaller revenue pool put any pressure on radio stations like the ones you've worked at to adapt and maybe be even more broad, or perhaps think in terms of, internet lingo, doing things that will go viral and so on?
Well, I know where I work, they are now big on podcasts because they want to be like a big hub. So they want the on-air broadcasting, but they also want it to be where people go to listen to podcasts as well. So they do about 40 or 50 podcasts. Now, I don't know whether the number of people that listen to podcasts and the number of people that listen to radio, whether the monetary factor is the same. I don't think it is. I think they charge more per 1,000 listeners on radio than they do for the podcast. So already, if people are listening to podcasts, they're not making as much money. If you took Google and those Meta and all those companies out of the equation, radio stations will still be making a lot of money. And then they'd be spending a lot of money on staff and newsrooms and resources. But that's not happening now, or even TV stations. When I first started, every radio station had their own newsroom. Every radio station had a person at State Parliament. You could have somebody at the courts. You could have somebody who was a police reporter. So you've got first-hand information coming in. That doesn't happen. We're the last one sort of still holding the fort with news. And our news goes pretty much all around Victoria because there's no one else doing it. So if you're in Warrnambool or in Sale or these places, and I know in Sydney now they're talking about the overnight news that used to happen from midnight onwards, not doing it anymore. So you have 4 hours at night or early morning where you don't have any news at all. That's a cost thing. It costs money to do that. And people don't get trained as well as they used to.
You're working with some duds at 3AW at the moment?
Well, I wouldn't say duds, but there was a standard that you had to meet to be on the radio, to read, to talk. We don't have that anymore. We don't have the skilled people that used to be able to say, well, for example, in 1970, the Westgate Bridge fell. Now, if that was to happen now, a radio station would send somebody out there who would find out what's going on, talk to people, and let people know what happened. All of these terrorist attacks that happen. I wonder whether we've got the ability to be able to do that now, like we used to be able to do.
Now it would just be people watching first-hand footage on YouTube, perhaps, instead of...
Well, now, for example, police conferences. We used to send people to police conferences, and now that all comes on the computer. So the police go to their own little studio. They have a media conference. Some journos go there, the newspapers. Even the newspapers have slimmed down. We're in a building in the city that was 7 stories, 7 floors. That was the age, and we were at the top floor, 3AW. Bit by bit, the age got so small that they all went down to one floor, the second floor. So everybody that worked on those other floors was made redundant.
Yeah. And it affects the quality of journalism, like you were saying. It's interesting, so many people who don't work in the industry complain about the standard of journalism out there today. But then if you ask people, well, do you pay for journalism?
They won't.
They won't. So we're in a bit of a conundrum because people, they know that the standard of journalism is quite low, but they also won't pay for it. So where do we go from here?
Well, I don't know where we go from here, and it has implications everywhere. In the old days, you had suburban newspapers that followed what councils do. So put a bit of a microscope on what councils and councillors do. I think here in Victoria we've had a very 10 years of a lot of things happening at state parliament that had we had a better media would have put a bit more of a focus on it. But now what we have, and particularly during COVID, we've got young people who work at state parliament who don't know the history of things and don't know the standard of transparency that they used to apply. In the old days, politicians, if they did something wrong, they would resign. They don't tend to do that so much now.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's as a result of PR marketing spin?
Yeah, I think they're prepared to tough stuff out. I think standards have slipped in that area. You know, Andrew Peacock, former opposition leader, never made it to Prime Minister. His wife in the 1970s did some advertising for a bedsheet company, and that was seen as the wrong thing to do. And as a result of that, he resigned.
Sorry.
A Premier of New South Wales was given a $3,000 bottle of wine that he didn't declare to anyone. And when they found out about it, he resigned. So these are tiny little things, but it shows that there are ramifications and you've got to behave at the top level. Well, we don't do that anymore. And bit by bit, that's all been. I mean, Lawyer X, the worst thing to happen in Victoria, perverted the course of justice. No one was held to account. Not one person. Well, Lawyer X was a case where a lawyer was informing police as well as advising her clients. So she was the go-between. And she was doing that secretly with the imprimatur of the of high levels of the police. Now, went all the way to the High Court, and the High Court found that the police behaviour was reprehensible. There were no ramifications for it. That's just one thing. Hotel quarantine inquiry. I'm really angry about stuff like that because there used to be a much higher standard. These politicians, Ray, they use our money. It's our money that they're using. So we want them to spend that money well. And they've got this cavalier attitude that they can do stuff without being transparent and without, informing the public about things. And that disappoints me a lot. It was never like that. Not in my memory, anyway. I don't know about other countries, but now everything, a lot of things are commercial in confidence, and we've got freedom of information laws, but they release documents
Heavily redacted.
What's the point?
I was going to come on to this towards the end, but since you brought this up now, and I wanted to ask you, because I did go on your Twitter page, you have very strong opinions about a range of different issues.
My opinions are basically about Victoria. I don't really comment about federal politics, and I focus just on Victoria because I don't think people in Victoria are well catered for at the moment with what's going on. So I just try and highlight some things that, come to my attention. I like politicians to be honest and transparent.
I completely agree. On the other hand, it's also hard for them in a way because we have such a partisan media nowadays where things are misconstrued all the time. I mean, for example, I'm not a member of any political party, but
No, neither am I.
I imagine it would be very difficult.
Yeah.
For example, being a Labor politician, watching yourself on Sky News Australia coverage, right? And so it kind of goes both ways where everything they do has a negative light uncharitably shined upon it. But at the same time, you're right, they are also maybe not willing to resign or admit fault the way they used to in the past. But there's a flip side of that coin too. I mean, do you think we're becoming more like American media in the way that we handle domestic politics, the way we speak about domestic politicians?
Yeah, I think we are. Look, I've never been vocal like I have been in the last 10 years. And I come from very working class background. I mean, I grew up in Laylaw. my dad couldn't read or write. So I'm not like from some sort of born to rule area. Not establishment Melbourne or anything like that. I just want people who are in public office to tell the truth. And I don't like it when they try and pretend that they forget things. The worst thing I've seen in 42 years of doing this job is the hotel quarantine inquiry, where the government of Victoria spent $60 million of taxpayers' money hiring private security guards, and then no one was able to say who made the decision to do that. They held this inquiry and they all said they didn't recall, they don't recall. Now, I don't believe that. That inquiry was a farce, and that really got me angry. That was the worst thing. So I feel like I need to say something when I see things like that. Now, if the Liberal Party was in power and they were doing the same thing, I would say the same thing. It's not partisan, because I'm not left and I'm not right. I actually believe that every couple of years or couple of terms, you need to remove the government, put new people in there, start afresh, clean things out, because it's unhealthy.
You don't have any political identity, any underlying political philosophy that guides your perspective?
Well, I've changed as I've got older. I do think that free enterprise is something. I've seen people, Ray, come to Australia with nothing, and just through sheer tenacity and energy and their own abilities, create a big life for themselves. And I think there's still those opportunities, and that's magnificent. I love that. So what that's taught me is a lot of it comes back to yourself and how hard you're prepared to work, or what sacrifices you're prepared to make. And so I like that free enterprise sort of way of thinking. But, the Labor Party's free enterprise and the Liberal Party's free enterprise. They just put different emphasis on different things. I'm a bit wary of unions, because I know people have a right to band together, and there's an imbalance between employer and employee. But then unions, they take the piss. I mean, Ray, in Victoria at the moment, we're building these big build projects. I know for a fact that there are people holding stop-go signs, earning $180,000 a year. Now, they're doing that because they're doing a bit of overtime and working at night. But a nurse, a paramedic, a policeman, they're not earning that sort of money.
No.
And they're training 4 or 5 years to do that. And if you're a police officer, you're taking your life in your own hands when you go to work. I mean, that's been distorted by unions. That's what I don't like.
But if we had a world where, and I certainly agree, I mean, 6 figures is a lot for holding signs, but, let's look at somewhere like Amazon. We don't want that either. And how do we prevent a situation like the ones that occur in Amazon, where workers are having to, urinate in bottles instead of, getting bathroom breaks? I don't see any way other than via unions, right?
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's a balance. You pointed one thing, and I pointed out the other thing, and in between there's a balance. My dad was a worker. My mum worked in factories. My brothers are all workers, and what I do isn't like a high end up there either. So you do need good standards for workers. But in Australia, we really have that. In Australia, you come here, if you're not born here and you come from overseas, you see a lot of opportunities here. it's just there's so much that you can do. We're a growing country, a population of 26 million. That population's going to be 35 million within our lifetime if we live a reasonable life. That means houses, that means roads, that means a lot of opportunities for people. And it's there to be grabbed hold of.
So you're positive about the future, generally speaking.
Well,
I mean,
well, in that way I am. I'm a bit worried about things like AI and...
But housing, I mean, 35 million people eventually. We're in the middle of a housing shortage. I mean,
well,
for a lot of people, there's anxiety with those things, right?
Yeah. And there's we do have a housing shortage, and it is a big problem. But again, if you're paying somebody $180,000 to hold a stop-go sign, you're paying somebody more than that to be an electrician on these big bills, or carpenter, or whatever trade you are. They're not building houses. Then they're going to come off that and build houses for cheaper. I mean, that's the problem with Australia, is building is too expensive. And that's why the cost of housing is so much. The problem is we haven't built enough houses, and we need to build more houses. Now, we don't have the trades. There's also been a focus on sending people to university. Education is a great thing, but also you need a bit of practical, people doing practical jobs, people doing those skills that they used to do in Italy, which was muratore, plumber, all those sort of jobs.
TAFE is free now at the moment, isn't it?
I think in some areas, yeah, they're trying to.
So they're trying to encourage people.
Yeah, but not enough people. Like, all my kids went to university, and I think doing a trade is, I would love to have done a trade. Looking back,
I have no skills whatsoever.
Yeah,
no practical
yeah.
skills.
Well, I've tried to do stuff with houses and stuff, renovating, which I can do a bit. But I think if you can build a house, you've got a magnificent skill.
Definitely.
And in Australia, that's where the money's been made, in property. People that got into property and start building houses, they've done. You don't make it by being a poet or a philosopher.
Unfortunately not. I know what you're going to say to this, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. Isn't part of the problem, though, and I say this as someone who doesn't own any property, should housing be an investment? Isn't it wrong that we view housing as an investment rather than just somewhere to live? Because that also contributes to these ridiculous inflated prices. If housing is something that you invest in and that you seek to continuously accumulate, I mean, that can't be good for the broader society either.
Well, Italians came here with nothing, and they sometimes three families live together in the one house. Okay, so then they recognised having a roof over your head is really important. And so sometimes, I know people with 7, 8, 9, 10 houses. I value that. I know someone who's a billionaire. I value that. I think the alternative is to say, well, you can only do this. You can only have one house, and you can only have this much money, and you can only... Why would you put a stop? If someone wants to shoot for the stars, let them shoot for the stars. And if they reach the stars, how magnificent is that? The problem is not that they've got 10 houses. The problem is that there aren't enough houses for everybody. That's the real problem.
Yeah, look, if we lived in a society where everyone had a house, I wouldn't care that someone has 50 houses, right? But I suppose we live in a society where some people are struggling week to week. They can't afford to pay rent. And it's not so much about what people can or can't do, but it's just the reality that, there are limited resources.
Well, we've got a lot of land in Australia, so there's plenty of places where people can have houses. It's just that we're not building them. I also think that in Australia, I get people at work say how tough it is. It's always been tough.
Has it?
Ray, to buy a house. Yes. My dad came here in 1949. He bought a little tiny house at 115 Clark Street, Northcote, in 1955 with no furniture. Then he had enough money to have my mum come over with my oldest brother. And then we lived in this tiny little house, 2 doors down from the railway line. Then we went to Coffs Harbour and bought a banana plantation in the middle of nowhere. It would have been the cheapest banana plantation you could buy. And we lived in a makeshift house with another family. And we did that for 3 years. Then we went to another banana plantation. And then we came back and Dad bought a house in Laylaw and 2 blocks of land in Laylaw. You know, it was tough back then. People had to make big sacrifices. You don't buy a house by not making sacrifices. It's not possible. People who are older, who might be watching this, would know that. When I hear people, oh, I can't buy a house, you can buy something. You can buy an apartment, or you can buy something on the outskirts of the city. I don't believe that after 4 or 5 years, you can't get together something to put a deposit on buying a house. Mm-hmm. It just takes discipline.
You mentioned that your views have changed and now you're more in favour of free enterprise. What did you used to think about this sort of issue?
Well, not that I was never in favour of free enterprise. We came from poverty, so I know what it's like to be poor. And if you've got no education and you're poor, it's very, very difficult to break out of that. So the key is education. But that doesn't mean you have to be university qualified. The key is in knowing something that you're good at or that you're passionate about or that you can do, so you can then use that skill to do something. When I've changed, I guess the change is, if I was 20, I would have thought, oh, that's too hard. You can't do that. You just, you're going to be stuck in that way all the time. But what life's shown me is, no, you can do it. Lots of people have done it. History has shown that you can come to this country. Whether you can do it in other countries, I don't know. Whether you can do it in Italy, I'm not sure. But you can certainly do it here in Australia. There was a young kid I met. I'm going to interview him. He came from northern Italy, Venice. He came here because he couldn't speak English. He's been here 10 years, and now he's selling kitchen stuff on the internet. He's 28. He's doing really well. Some people just have that ability, and I love that. You know, some people don't have that ability, but we're all different. You know, some people want to be writers, artists, and stuff like that. We're all different, but I think fundamentally you can have a good life in Australia. You can buy yourself one house, and you can live a good, comfortable life in Australia. But it requires sacrifices.
You have probably been told this before, but you would make a killing reading audiobooks. Have you ever thought about that?
Funny you should say that, because in 2003, I'd organised to talk to Bolinda Books. The appointment was for a week in January, and that week my mum had a stroke, and she died about 4 months later. She'd never recovered, and I never went to that appointment, and I never followed it through. So I don't know. I've listened to, you know, when I first started, you used to tape yourself, and I've got this box at home, because my son Damien's also in radio, and I've got all these tapes, like about 150 tapes, and I've just given him the whole box, and he's gone through it. And you know, I had a higher pitched voice back then, and I didn't sound like this. The other thing too is my accent was different. You know, I sounded very like I came from Laylaw or came from... I know in Italy people learn how to speak sort of Middle Italian.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you, was there a concerted effort to change the way you came across on the radio?
It wasn't a concerted effort, but I had to record something, and I heard myself, and I went, oh, gee, that sounds a bit rough, a bit hard-edged. So you just sort of try and soften your vowels. But that's all. But I think over time, your ear just develops, and you just start to change, and you don't even realise that it's happening. It just day by day. Every day you're reading something. 5 days a week for 42 years. That's a long time, Ray. That's and you get older. I like a bit of whiskey, so whiskey changes the vocal cords a little bit. I used to smoke a long time ago, but I haven't smoked for ages.
I was going to ask you about that because here at Rete Italia, we have both you and Riccardo Schiru, both with phenomenal voices. Should I take up smoking, is my question.
No, don't smoke, Ray.
Okay, fair enough.
I had a friend of mine who smoked since he was 18, and I used to botch cigarettes off him, and he died at the age of 56. The thing is, you get older. I'm 64 now. I still in my mind think I'm 18, pushing trolleys in at Safeway where I used to work. But I'm not. I've got children and I've got grandchildren, and I'm at the end of this 40-year thing that I've been doing on radio, which is a pretty hard thing to come to terms with. And do I keep going? Do I stop? I'm inclined to keep going, maybe because I don't know anything else.
You also love it, by the sounds of
Well,
things.
I like the people involvement. I like knowing what's going on in the world. I love watching. I love going to Italy. I love following what Italy someone from outside can see things in a different way. Like I go to Italy, and I'm stunned at. Well, first of all, that Italy is not the number one tourist destination in the world.
It's France now, isn't it?
France, yeah. And I think Turkey's up there too.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But
mainly for the hair transplants, from what I've heard.
well, is that what it is?
Yeah, I think
maybe
so.
that's the reason. But Italy, to me, there should be Italy, and then there should be like a big gap before anybody else. Italy's got 70% of the world's renowned art, all of the World Heritage areas, the history, the food. It's got all of that stuff. It should be number one. But I was talking to someone the other day about it. I think they take it for granted. It could be a much bigger industry.
I agree with you that it should absolutely be number one. I remember Dylan Moran, an Irish comedian, calling it the cultural envy of the world. But then they're also doing things that maybe are contrary to their interests in the context of tourism. I mean, Venice recently introducing the €5 entry fee. I mean,
Well,
things
let
like
me
that.
tell you a story. I went to Matera in Basilicata, and I went to the tourist office, and the guy at the tourist desk had his head down and he was writing something. Now I stood at the counter, and I stood at the counter, and waited. And he didn't bother to look up and say, "Oh, I'm busy. Can you just?" I didn't look up. So I just walked out. Now that's just a little example. It's like had I spoken to him and we got to know each other, we probably would have liked each other. But it's like they already sort of think, "Oh, he's a tourist. I don't like him. I'm going to try and get the better of him." That's the sense I got. I remember when I got married and we went to Italy and we went to get some tickets for the train, and we queued up and queued up and queued up and queued up, and we finally got to the counter, and it was 1 o'clock, so the guy pulled the curtain down. And my wife got upset, and she was talking in her accent, and the guy picked up that she wasn't Italian, and then he started doing the kangaroo jump behind the counter.
Oh, wow.
Because she was from Australia.
Right.
Yeah.
Impressive that he could pick that up, though, being an Italian.
Yeah, well, my memory's hazy now. Maybe she told him, I don't know, but
Right.
I just remember he was doing the kangaroo jump behind the counter, and we thought, oh, bloody hell, they're the stories that you hear. And, you know, the Italians are beautiful, wonderful. I mean, I love staying in Airbnbs and going off, not in the cities. And I've had wonderful conversations with people, and they're all friendly and they're all magnificent. They all complain about the government and complain about high taxes. And in south of Italy, they complain about having no jobs and no industry.
They're also very proud at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they should be. They should be. Sicily is magnificent. Puglia is beautiful. Calabria is like, you know, in any other country, Calabria would be the main part to go to in that country, but it gets lost in all the other things that Italy has to offer.
It doesn't occupy headspace for foreigners. People don't really think of Calabria.
Well, when they go to Rome, Australians go to Rome, Florence, Venice.
And maybe the Amalfi Coast or something.
And the Amalfi Coast. But there are other stuff beyond. I mean, you know, I went to this Certosa near a town called Paluda in Basilicata. Right, that would have been a magnificent tourist attraction in itself in any other country. But I'm Italian and I didn't even know about it.
There's so much stuff that we've never heard of. Yeah. Speaking of which, I read a brief biography of yours written by Tony Brancatisano, and you mentioned to Tony that you didn't really identify very strongly with your Italian heritage until you went there for the first time in your 20s. I felt the same way, actually, and I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I was 2 when we left Melbourne to go to the banana plantation. And that was New South Wales, early 1960s. I went to a school where there was 15 kids, 1 teacher, no Italians. Then I went to another primary school and my cousins were Italian and that was it. So I hung around more Australian people. I followed cricket. You know, you'd think soccer would be the sport, but because played cricket.
And that's how you fell in love with radio?
Well, yeah, the teacher showed us to play cricket and I started playing cricket and I loved it. So 1960s New South Wales was a pretty wild place. I mean, Australia, white settlement, it was only 150 years old, so it's not that long ago that Australia, the way it is, was established. We went to school with no shoes, bare feet we went to school. So where did I learn my Italianness from? From my parents, but it wasn't really Italian. It was dialect. It was San Marco in Lamas. So I was embarrassed a little bit, I guess, about the food because kids would tease you.
Now they pay top dollar for it?
Well, Ray, you know, in my 21st birthday party, we had in my dad's garage, my parents' garage, and he had salamis and peppers and garlic hanging. And I wanted him to move it so that when we took the photographs, they weren't, but he didn't want to move them. So now they're in the photographs at the back. I'd
love to get hold of that photo. That's great.
So yeah, how things changed. But when I went back to Italy the first time, I went to the Commonwealth Games in Scotland for work, and then I had 4 days, and I thought, I'll go to San Marco. So I went to San Marco, and those 4 days were magical days. Every day I was meeting relations. My grandmother, who I hadn't seen, went to the cemetery. I was forcing myself to speak the dialect. It just, then coming back and walking through Rome was like, my parents were poor people who lived in the poor part of Italy. Rich tapestry, rich culture, but they weren't wealthy. So their view of Italy was that. I was stunned that Italy had a racetrack. When I went to Rome, I was stunned by the Vatican, the restaurants, you know, I still remember the hotel and the room that I stayed at when I first went to Rome the first night. And when I went to Italy last year, I went to the hotel and I spoke to the guy. I said, I remember coming here, and how long you been working here for? And he said, I've been here, because in Italy people have jobs for a long time in the same place. Anyway, the guy said Mussolini used to come to this hotel with his girlfriend. He had a particular room. It was not Via Nazionale, the one before that. Yeah, so that opened my eyes to Italy, and even, you know, like I went out with Australian girls, because I just didn't think that I wanted to marry an Italian girl. And then when I went to Italy and I saw how beautiful they were, and just simple beauty, beautifully dressed, I was knocked out by all of it, by all of it. And then I've been a disciple ever since. And then in 1990, one of the most famous guys to come out of our town, and I talk about him all the time, Professor Joseph Tuziani, wrote some books. His dad went to America in 1924 and left behind his mum with Joseph yet unborn. His mum was pregnant. So Joseph came out, they eventually settled in New York. He came out in 1990 and he read this most magnificent poetry in our dialect. And that's when it really, you know, Italy, when I went there, affected me, but that really affected me. And I thought, this is worth knowing a lot about.
I've heard that you're very passionate about maintaining the dialect as well.
I love the dialect because that's the first language that we spoke. You know, I used to get teased about it on air here because all I could speak was dialect. Growing up on a banana plantation, we didn't have Italian school to go to. By the time I was 15, I was doing other things. I was playing cricket and things. I didn't want to go to Italian school, so I never learnt this. I was a bit embarrassed that I couldn't speak Italian properly. And I still can't, but I try when I go to Italy. When I go to Italy though, Ray, they say, ma tu parli italiano bene.
They're very complimentary.
Yeah, well, maybe they're just being nice.
No, I'm sure you do, but they're also very nice.
But, you know, I really love that when they say that, because I think, oh, well, I've come a little bit full circle, you know. But the dialect is I'm passionate about, because it's pure. My dad left Italy in 1949. Now, they would have only just got radio. They had no television. So the dialect was untainted by any media. And I learnt from him and from Mum, our dialect. And my kids know a few words in dialect. But it is just another language.
I'd love to learn. My mum's actually very similar. Where my mum only speaks Neapolitan. She doesn't speak standard Italian.
Yep.
And she, even to this day, is actually quite embarrassed by the fact that she only speaks dialect. And she shouldn't be. I would like to learn myself. It's a shame that I don't.
Neapolitan songs is just fantastic.
But I think a lot of people who speak dialect, growing up, they're told somehow that it's dirty Italian, if that makes sense, or it's a bastardization of Italian.
Interesting you say that, because when I first started here, I started here in 2008, and I used to only speak the dialect. And I'm sure that was a big shock to a lot of people, because they weren't expecting to hear dialect spoken in an official sort of forum like on the radio. And I was totally unaware of this. And people would ring up and imitate me. You know, I'd be driving to work listening to Rete Italia, Ivano Ercole or somebody, and someone ringing up having a go at having me on the radio. He shouldn't be on the radio. Oh, he shouldn't be on the radio. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. And but I could never understand it. So
did it bother you?
Well, no. But if anything, it sort of made me think, like, look, my view was, I don't give a shit. This is what I speak. I'm quite, I speak it well. And this is the way it is. That's life. Now, I did a bit of investigation about it. Well, I'll tell you why, because I used to get this guy coming on, and he was educated in Australia and educated in Italy. So he spoke Italian and English perfectly. One wasn't better than the other. And I spoke really bad Italian. In fact, I spoke like my mum. You know, she would look at television and see the Queen, and she'd say, "Oh, guarda che bella capite che te la Queen ha. Look what beautiful hat the Queen's got." of course, Regina is the word, but here in Australia, she would say La Quina. Well, anyway, this guy got upset about it, and I'm embarrassed on air. I'm embarrassed by the fact that you still don't know the correct word for queen. Is Regina. And we had a bit of an argy-bargy argument about it, so that sort of stuff was going on. But I think it's changed in the 16 years I've been doing it. The dialect is a bit more revered now. People come on and they read their poems from their own towns.
I agree. I think that people are starting to understand that it is a language. It's its own language.
Yeah.
It doesn't come from Italian. It evolved alongside Italian.
And it doesn't have, in Italy they have the connotation, used to be that if you spoke dialect, you were a cafona. You were a guy that just hasn't been educated. You lived on the land, so you just speak your dialect and you haven't been educated. And I can understand why people would have that thing, but it shouldn't be that. It's just another language. Italy was many different provinces and regions, so it had to come together to be a unified country, and it needs one unified language. That's true. But I think now it's got to a point where Italy can have that unified language, but can also have these other regional languages.
And encourage it.
Yeah, and encourage it. And because young kids can learn English, they can learn Italian, and they can learn their dialect. And that way the dialect keeps going, because why would you kill it?
Absolutely.
It doesn't make sense to me. And then when you hear these poems in the dialect, it raises the emotional level to another, to a great height. These poems that Joseph Tuziani wrote, I've memorised them. That's how much they've affected me. And I find myself, driving in the car and I'm saying them to myself because I just want to hear the sounds.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel exactly the same way. As I said, I don't speak dialect, but when I hear Neapolitan, it feels different to me. There's something very nostalgic about it because that's how my grandparents spoke. And so, yeah, I completely understand that. You mentioned you had a bit of an argy-bargy, to steal your term, with that guy on the radio. How are you with conflict in general? Because I would imagine that over time, especially when you're having any sort of disagreement with someone on air, it's something you would have to get used to and more comfortable with, or were you always comfortable with that? Even just talking with you about housing, not that we were arguing or anything, but just anything approaching disagreement, I find myself starting to go inward and kind of getting afraid, right? How did you cope with that?
I have to watch myself not to be too, because I can be loud and I can, not aggressive is not the word, but firm, And I don't it's like Italian families is around the dinner table. We talk loudly. We've talked like that in our family all the time. So I guess that's what I'm like. So sometimes I feel like I have to consciously just state my case quietly and purposefully. And sometimes you can get a bit animated and you start sort of pointing and those sort of things. Conflict never really bothered me. In fact, not that I like conflict, because I don't think conflict's a negative thing, but I like good discussion,
But being recorded, it adds a different element. Because I agree, I love discussion, but having one of those discussions whilst there's a camera in your face, you're broadcasting to the entire state, that never plays on your mind? No, probably did early. Not here ever. No, I always felt comfortable coming here for some reason. I think when I first got into it, of course you're nervous, When I first started at 8HA Alice Springs, the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory used to come in for a chat. And, that was a bit nerve-wracking because it was the first time I was doing it. But I was 23, 24, I was young, When I came here, I was in my late 40s, so I was a bit more confident of who I was and what I thought about things. That's why I didn't really bother me that people were imitating my dialect. In fact,
I found it quite humorous, actually. And I loved the people, the listeners. I mean, I didn't really. I remember that occasion. It all came to a head one Friday, and I said to the guy who said, he actually said, "I'm ashamed of the way you speak Italian."
Wow.
And I was taken aback a little bit, and I paused, and I said, "Well, if you're ashamed, you better get out of the studio." So then he got up and left. And then I thought, because I sensed this, that did people really want me to be here or not? So then I opened the lines and I said, we've got an hour and a half. If you don't want me to be here, I won't come. I don't need to come here. Why would I impose myself? And we took calls, like about 25, 30 calls, and not one was against me. They could understand that what I was doing was...
That's such a big risk that you took, though. Can you imagine if all 25 or 30...
Well, I wouldn't have come. It wasn't really a big
It's very
risk.
brave.
It wasn't really a big risk because I just wouldn't have come.
Yeah, fair enough.
I would have just done what I did. But I think it was interesting that... Because really what we were trying to do was reach people, maybe even like yourself, who couldn't speak Italian, who somehow related to me because I'm trying to speak Italian. And I was, it's not easy making a fool of yourself trying to talk Italian on air when you know everybody's sort of judging you. But you can do it if you just you just think, look, that's the way it is. What can I do? Sombarada così, what do they want from me? I grew up on a banana plantation. I think if you have that attitude, then it's easier. Like this. I always remember a guy called Roberto, rang up from Perth. The first show I did, I said, voglio imparare a parlare italiano più raffinato, I said. And it's raffinato.
Right.
So I messed that word up. Anyway, and 3 weeks later, this guy, Robert, rings up and goes, I be listening to you. You'll now improve. I go, Roberto, it's only been 3 weeks. What are you talking about? How long you been in Australia? I come to Australia in 1969. Roberto, you've been here 50 years. Your English is like my Italian. See, they don't understand.
No.
We're both trying to do the same thing. You know how it's difficult for you to learn English? Because this is your second language and because you came here as an older person? Well, it's like that for me to learn Italian.
No self-awareness.
Yeah, maybe self-awareness is what it is. Or it's just, they just wanted to have a go at me. They just... winding me up, but I took it for what it was. It's just fun. It's not having a go at me. But I was good that people supported me because I would have thought, oh well, I'm just not going to do Italian radio. I'll walk away, and they can have somebody who speaks Italian perfectly. But it's great that they give me this opportunity, and it's great that James Liotta is now on here, because this has to change. It can't just be what it used to be for the older generation to keep going.
Do you see it being important to have some content in English?
Well, I see it important to try and reach people of Italian background who, I used to listen sometimes and I'd hear the news, blah, 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 blah. What the hell is he talking to? Talking too fast for me. I love the music. And if I could find somebody who I could relate to, who I could understand, it gives me something else to listen to when I feel like it. So I think radio can be very powerful. You reach people you don't even know in all parts of Australia, and in fact all over the world. When I went to Sicily, I caught up with a guy who listens to us. He was from Perth, and 6 months of the year is in Capo d'Orlando in Sicily, and he listens from there.
Wow.
Another guy, Antonio, from Roviga. So that's the beauty of what we have now with media and the internet. And You know.
I've even seen some of the analytics here. Yeah, there are people in Canada, the US listening to Rete Italia.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's fascinating. So let's go the complete opposite of conflict, because I've been told by my producer, learn how to do this, because I think I just exude discomfort. So when you have someone on your show,
I think you're too hard on yourself. No.
when you have someone on your show, how do you go about making them comfortable, especially if you can tell that they're a bit nervous, they're about to be on air?
When I first came here, I felt like there was Italians in senior positions tend to talk down to people. That's what I think. You know, whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know. The Australian way is to talk across, or even to lower yourself and talk up, you know. So when someone comes in, you're not lowering yourself, but you're just non-threatening, and you talk quietly, and you give people the opportunity to say what they want to say, and you stay silent while they're saying. I don't like to interrupt. Sometimes I find myself I do, because I just want to get something out.
Right.
But I mean, it's a skill to just sit and wait for the person to finish talking, and then to say something. So it's all of that. But I think just to lower the temperature, keep it as casual as you possibly can, and I think also, if you ask people about themselves, they know everything they need to know. They don't have to do any preparation. They don't have to remember stuff. They know their own lives. You know, where do they come from? What was mum and dad like? You know, what motivates them? Why they do what they do? It's not rocket science. You know, Larry King, the guy that used to be on in the United States, it's what he used to do. And I think you'd be honest too, like Larry King, I always remember his story. When he first got on the radio, he was so nervous, nothing came out. And after a couple of minutes, he put the music down, and he struck on what's true, and that is, he was honest. He said, look, this is the first time I'm on the radio, and I'm nervous. Please be aware of that. And if you say that, people normally think, oh, well, look at that, you know. So just be honest.
Mm.
Say what you think. Always be respectful. Sometimes you can be a bit cheeky or a bit, you know, but don't take shit. I think you've got to stand up for yourself as well. And that's it. And I think it's also being, you know who you like and who you don't like. So if people like you or they respect you, they'll take what you say with a bit more gravity than if you're a dislikable person.
I want to ask you about something. I don't know if you said this to Tony tongue-in-cheek, and maybe there was nothing really here, but maybe...
Tony who?
The person who wrote your biography.
Oh, Tony Brancatisano.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, your first job in Alice Springs in '82, you mentioned that you were a bit too full of yourself. I'd love to know in what way. Like, how do you look back on yourself in those days, and how do you judge yourself then?
Ray, I think humility is just the most magnificent thing. And because why wouldn't we be humble? Who do we think we are? We are just human beings, come in the same way, go out the same way. We, in our heads, sometimes think we're this or we're that, but we're not really any of that. It's just in our heads. My dad couldn't read or write, but he was smart as a razor blade. He was as sharp as a razor blade. But, you know, when you're 22 or 23 and you went from pushing trolleys in at Safeway to then thinking you're some big guy in Alice Springs because you're on the radio, maybe that's what I meant. But life fixes all that up, you know. I think as you get older, you realise you play a little part. We're not saving lives. we're not giving someone a heart transplant. We're not resolving the problems with cancer or sorting out Middle East peace. We're just doing our job. And hopefully through doing our job, we touch somebody or somebody listens to something and it changes their life. You know, I used to talk to Maria Mercuri. She was a psychologist. And I thought that was really important. I got her on quite early because I think, you know, in the Italian community, mental illness was always like...
repressed.
Repressed, yeah. So it's good to talk about the fact that everybody has problems at some stage in their life, and to sort out those problems, you need to go and talk to somebody. So they're the sort of things that I like to try and do. I think good, you know, people believe in God, I believe in good, putting that extra O in the word God. And try and do good things if you can. You know, not that I'm an angel, because I'm not, but, you know, we have a privilege here. We talk to people, take it seriously.
I've really enjoyed having you on, and I want to thank you again. I'd just like to finish off on one last thing, because I read that the reason you started working at Rete Italia was because you thought your dad would get a kick out of it, because he used to listen.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could tell us about when he passed, what you left with him.
Well, let me tell you the story. I used to go to see my dad on a Friday evening, and we'd sit down and have a cup of tea or something, and then we'd go outside and he'd have a cigarette, and I'd bought a cigarette off him, and he'd tell me all about what was happening at Rete Italia did this, and Ivano Ercoli did this, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So I thought he'd get a kick out of me being on Italian radio. So when Nicoletta came into 3AW, I said, you guys should have an English-speaking English-speaking program. So anyway, I did the show, and I knew that if I could make my dad laugh, then other people were laughing as well. And he loved it, you know. And he got a kick out of me being on Italian radio. And in 2011, at the age of 94, Ray, after smoking since the age of 8, he got lung cancer. And he had been so healthy all his life. And in 6 weeks, he went from diagnosis to dying. And he died on the 21st of September, 2011. And in his coffin, we put his little transistor radio, and we had it tuned to 1593 AM, which was the old frequency for Rete Italia. And I noticed a couple of years later, they sold that frequency to Craig Hutchison and his SEN, and now he puts horse racing on that frequency. Right. And Dad always hated horse racing. No. He used to say the only way to follow a horse is with a shovel. Oh, wow.
Tony Tardio, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for asking me.